The extraordinary scenes from the mayhem inside the Capitol building will leave an indelible stain on America. A man walking through the Capitol with a Confederate flag, another wearing a sweatshirt which bore the name of a Nazi concentration camp, and a violent mob at the doors of the nation's capital were met with a police response that the Biden administration says represents an unequal system of justice.
No one can tell me that if had been a group of Black Lives Matter protesting yesterday, they wouldn't have been treated very, very differently than the mob of thugs that stormed the Capitol. We all know that's true. And it is unacceptable, totally unacceptable. The American people saw it in plain view, and I hope it sensitized them to what we have to do.
So has the police handling of the pro-Trump supporters who stormed the Capitol building last week changed perceptions among Americans about the double standards within law enforcement as they brace for more potential violence? Joining me now is Michael Eric Dyson, professor of sociology at Georgetown University and author of the new book, Long Time Coming: Reckoning with Race in America. Professor Dyson, the threat that was posed by insurgents marching on Capitol Hill with a Confederate flag and other symbols of white supremacy were obviously not taken seriously enough. Or maybe, as the majority whip in the House of Representatives, James Clyburn, said, somebody on the inside of those buildings was complicit in this. How damning, how shocking were the images of some police officers standing by and watching the rioters make their way into the building when you compare them to the heavy-handed treatment that Black unarmed protesters receive.
It's an astonishing display of disloyalty to the most loyal citizens in this country. Black people, despite the Confederate flag, Black people, despite the Civil War, which leveraged the authority of the South and its economic institutions against the bodies of Black people, still remain loyal. Black people, despite the resurgence of white supremacy, of white nationalism, of the Proud Boys, still hold on to the premise that this is e pluribus unum out of many one, and yet the complicity of those within that building, and not just now, hundreds of years, of complicity with the undercutting, undermining of American democracy. And I think Representative Clyburn is absolutely right, that this ridiculous repudiation of the premises and principles of democracy by those who are ostensibly in our favor, who should be holding to account outside forces, police forces, law enforcement, which should be holding the thin blue line or black line or red line or whatever line that is that protects the Capitol, the most sacred space in civic society in American culture, and yet it was given over to the loose and easy besiegement by racist and anti-Semitic, anti-Arabic forces that reigned superior in that moment. And the hurt and the pain and the trauma that citizens of color and other minorities experience should reverberate throughout the entire country, because this was not simply an attack upon people of color and vulnerable citizens. It was an attack upon American society itself.
Some of the rioters even said on tape, they're on our side, about some of the police officers. What would have happened, can you imagine for a moment, if a group of African Americans were having just a conversation on social media about storming the Capitol building, let alone scaling the building itself or being almost shown in?
They would have been arrested. They would have been taken into custody. On site, they would have been severely mistreated and shot, many of them. We have no doubt that the bodies would have piled up, that the excuses that would be made by the law enforcement would be that we felt under threat. This Capitol was under threat. This citadel of democracy was under threat, and we had no choice but to unleash bullets and a barrage of batons and mace and whatever, tear gas and whatever was necessary to control that crowd. How do we know this? Because during Black Lives Matter, which were largely nonviolent, and when they did turn violent, it was the presence of other elements that were extraneous to Black Lives Matter. So here we have a civil protest against racial injustice being tear gassed and broadly mistreated. And on the other hand, white bigots and anti-patriots and anti-loyalists to this nation were holding high the banner of disloyalty, the Confederate flag being dragged through the halls of the Capitol, and not a peep.
And yet, you say all this, but recent polls that were taken after last week's riots show that a very small majority of Americans, just 52%, say Trump should be removed from office for inciting this insurrection. 45% disagree. What does it tell us about the number of people in America today who still support a president who urges his followers to march on the Capitol building and who still support him for everything he stands for, including an unwillingness to condemn groups like the Proud Boys?
It is extraordinarily dispiriting that the major avatar, the major symbol, the major representative of American democracy, the head of the American government, is himself complicit in the undermining of this particular governmental building, the symbol of American life, because of his narrow, narcissistic, self-preoccupied hurt, grief, and pain over losing an election. He has literally elevated his particular party, and more especially his particular existential fate, above the fate of the nation. This is as dangerous an affront to American democracy as we have seen in quite some time.
But is it unexpected? Should we be surprised? We heard Joe Biden and many Republicans say this is not America. But many African Americans disagree. The newly sworn in Congresswoman Cori Bush wrote a piece, an op-ed in the Washington Post, in which she compared the kid's glove treatment by police of white supremacists on Capitol Hill with the brutal treatment of black protesters last summer, how they were beaten, tear gassed to the point of suffocation and shot at for much, much less. Do you agree with those who say this is America and will continue to be America until white supremacy is dismantled?
There is no question. This is America. Excuse me. This is an America that many white brothers and sisters don't see, refuse to see, close their eyes on. And until the Capitol was attacked, and even now only a slight majority, 52%, see it as the reason that Donald Trump should be removed, many of them, until that extreme measure, won't even acknowledge that there is a problem. So yes, they refuse to see the buildup to this infamy, the buildup to this treachery, the buildup to this traitorous activity. The moment you begin to take black bodies for granted and put them on the ground beneath the knee of Derek Chauvin, that was an attack on American democracy. So it doesn't surprise me at all that many white brothers and sisters refuse to this day to see the vicious anti-American sentiment that is betokened and vouchsafed when they make statements about Donald Trump and make America great again, and making sure that their narrow slice of the Republican ideology and the far right-wing beliefs are held up high, even above the principles of this nation.
But some say they see it. Biden says the injustice is plain for everyone to see. What can he actually do to change this culture that has existed for so long?
That's a great question. What he can do at minimum is change the attitude, change the disposition, change the agreement with the President of the United States of America embracing those kinds of ideas. No, speak up boldly. Use what Teddy Roosevelt called your bully pulpit. Speak out directly and without equivocation and without false equivalencies between both sides, and say this is wrong. This is a travesty of justice, and the bully pulpit of the United States of America that is given to the President of the United States must clearly articulate it. We already have laws on the books. We have the discourteous treatment that devolved into horrible, illegal treatment. That stuff is already on the books. What it takes is something more, a spiritual revival of an American determination to be free for all peoples and to embrace the broadest conception of democracy possible. That's what he can do to change the temperature, to make sure that it is not taken seriously, the white supremacy and white nationalism as the basis of American democracy, and to shame these people and to say to them, you are not America, and this is not what we will accept. Yes, it is America.
But will this happen? Will this happen? You said last June, while the country was gripped with police brutality and calls for racial justice, that even when it looks dark, the stars are shining, that we've got to hope, that this is a great time. You said you were hopeful because you believe that together we will prevail. Have the events of the last week, though, changed your mind? Can you still be optimistic?
Not at all, because this ain't the worst we've seen, right? When you talk about people who were enslaved, enchained, people who were raped, pillaged, and plundered, people whose bodies were desecrated, murdered, castrated, tossed into the Tallahatchie River like Emmett Till. So we've seen far worse than this. But now perhaps America will wake up and understand that their destiny is tied up with our destiny, their fate with the fate of Black Lives Matter. So when we see the essential coming together of those two principles and ideals, then we begin to make a difference. I am not optimistic. That is a shallow virtue. I am hopeful. That is far deeper. Hope against hope. Hope when there's no evidence that we should be hoping. Hope when there's no indication that what we believe in will overcome. But if we continue to invest in it, we continue to shape the future according to the vision and the sacred imagination that we bring to bear upon these events in our country.
Professor Michael Eric Dyson, great to have you on the program. Thanks so much for making the time.
Thanks for having me.